the first thing we have to talk to you about is the cost cap news that has literally just come out in the last few hours. So we're going to bring up a graphic now. This is going to show exactly what's happened in terms of which teams are found to be in breach. So we have Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, Alpine, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, Williams and Haas in compliance. But Aston Martin have been found to have a procedural breach, and Red Bull have been found to have a minor overspend breach, which, Martin, I just want to get your initial thoughts to that and the implications that might have going forward.
Well, first of all, I'd say what seems absolutely crazy to me is that a minor breach can be up to 5% overspend on the cost cap. That's 7 million. We know that's a massive upgrade on a car, maybe even a B spec for some teams. So that needs tightening up for starters, because what's the point in having 140 million, whatever the number ends up being, and then having this 5% variant. So I'm assuming that the FIA will have to crack down hard on any minor breaches, but it looks like it could be a reprimand or a fine. Will they want to revisit points? Will they be manufacturers' points or drivers' points for 2021? Other teams are saying, well, look, this gives you a head start into 22. The cars are carried over for 23. So, this is a big advantage. Now, we know that pretty much all of the teams are gaming this system within their interpretation of the regulations to varying degrees. But quite clearly, and it's quite amazing that this information got out over the Singapore Grand Prix weekend. Where did it come from, and how did it get out? But it does seem that Red Bull have crept over the limit. We're hearing numbers of £1.8 million. Unfortunately, we're not being told that today. We'll have to wait and see. So what will their penalties be? How hard do the FIA want to be on this? Is it about, Christian Horner told me, it's an interpretation issue on a number of items. They thought they were under. Some things have been included now. So it's not, it appears, the great crime that we were being told by other team principals in Singapore. So we await the news. I think the cost cap system is brilliant in terms of it's been a cornerstone of why Formula One is in a better place today than it has, in my view, ever been. And it's very hard to come up with a set of regulations that can cope with, a team like Haas, for example, that doesn't have a factory effectively, to the unbelievable setup of McLaren, Ferrari with its own road car manufacturing, for example, Red Bull with its Red Bull technologies and all the different elements these teams have and the different structures they have to them. Red Bull, on an industrial estate in Milton Keynes, for example. So something that equalizes all of these different 10 teams in Formula One is very hard to do. It's obviously very, very complex. So we'll see if the FIA want to come down hard on the first year of that. But certainly it needs tightening up, because the other teams will be under pressure. The team possibly, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you overspend a bit and pay a fine or get a slap on the wrist and go a tenth or two faster? So we need clarity, and it needs to be rigid, and a 5% variance is way too much.
Well, Martin, how do we, police this problem in, going forward? Obviously, as you mentioned, there's so many different factors for the compliance board to look into. It's so hard to go into every detail, but at the same time, this has been another tricky weekend for Formula One in terms of, interpretation. I think so often, probably too often, we talk about things being left up to interpretation. So, how do we tackle that? How does Formula One and the FIA deal with this going forward?
Well, I guess there's going to be a number of areas that were grey in terms of interpretation and which salaries are in or out, or costs are in or out, and they'll just have to be tightened up. And we the regulations. I mean, there's so many pages of it. It's such a complex job. I think the concept initially was, well, at least it's going to stop the team spending 200, 300, 400 million. That's been achieved, but now we've got to look at the last few million to make it fair and across the board. And it's also about keeping the pack closer on the grid, the haves and have-nots, as it were, in terms of the sponsorship and the resource, the facilities that they have available to them. So I think I think fundamentally it's been a success, but it's just the detail now, and it's got to be made clear that you stick to the cost cap or just under it. Otherwise, it's going to hurt.
Well, as you mentioned, it does come down to the detail. And as you said as well, it's been alleged that it's a ballpark figure of around 1.8 million. But, that does sound little in the grand scheme of things. But actually, the gain from that amount of money can actually be quite a big deal.
Yeah, it could be a new front wing or a floor or something like this. So, as I say, I think all of the teams will be somehow or other making the absolute most of their interpretation of these regulations as to which overheads are suddenly no longer in this department, or which personnel are over there working on something else. But I think also, and it's a good thing, but the corporate governance of somebody like Mercedes-Benz, for example, is such that they just can't be seen to be breaching something like this. And I think that needs to be the same for all the teams. And I like to think, and I understand it to be the case, that somebody like Toto has to sign a document to comply with these, and Christian Horner at Red Bull, and all the key personnel, all the financial personnel should be personally locked into this. I think that's a critical area, so that they're personally responsible and accountable, as well as their company, in being transparent and honest and accurate with these numbers.
Do you think it harms the integrity of the sport, events like these?
Not really, no. I think this is, as long as it's controlled and as long as the penalties are crystal clear and hard enough, I think it's a bit like, a double diffuser or a floppy front wing, or people game that system as well. That's Formula One for you. It's all about reading the regulations once to see what they say, and twice to see how to get around them in terms of beating the other 9 rivals in the same piece of paddock and pit lane as all the other races through the year. So I think controlling, because if you didn't, then teams would be spending 500, 600, 700 million. They'd just spend as much money as they can because they're competitive animals. So I think it's fundamentally a good system, and it's in its early stages. We have to remember that. But I think as I say, it's a cornerstone of why Formula One's strong at the moment.
I guess as part of what feels so strange to me right now is that, we know what the crimes committed are, but we don't know what the penalties are. We know that there's a list that says it could be this or it could be this, but it seems strange to decide what the penalty will be after we already know, who's breached the regulations, who hasn't, and how much they've breached it by.
Well, it's very disappointing that information hasn't been supplied today, isn't it? Remember, we're talking about the 2021 season, not this season. So quite why they haven't been able to get together, now they know the details. Presumably there's some squabbling going on behind the scenes to mitigate this and explain and come up with some reasoning. And it's thoroughly disappointing that we've now had this announcement of what's happened, but we don't know the consequences.
Yeah. Moving it on to slightly more positive news, and Max Verstappen's second World Championship. And Martin, you weren't with us on the coverage this weekend, but it would be great to get your thoughts on Max's win. And, it has been a season, really, hasn't it, in terms of just complete domination from the Dutchman?
He's been amazing this year. Obviously, the likes of Lewis haven't had a car to compete with him. Ferrari have, but they've stepped on their own tails a few times. And despite an awful start for Max with 2 retirements in the first 3 races, he has been supreme out there. And I thought, actually, his move around the outside of the first 2 corners, having lost out effectively away from the start to Charles Leclerc, was extraordinary. And it demonstrated everything you needed to know about Max Verstappen's talent, his feel behind the wheel. You've got to drive 2 cars when you're going into the first and second corner in the pouring rain on intermediates. In Suzuka, you're driving the car on the inside, working out how much he's likely to slide, driving your own car, how much space you've got and how much you're likely to slide, and just steaming around the outside and keeping it all together. Summarised to me Max's season right at that moment in terms of his confidence, his ability, his comfort level in the car and with his own team, and it has been dominant. It was only a matter of time before he was announced as the world champion. Unfortunately, it seemed to be a bit after the race actually finished, didn't it?
Yeah, a little bit more confusion there, but we do know now that he is the world champion. Officially. But something we've got to talk about, Martin, as well. We saw that you tweeted about it this weekend, something that, horrified me as a driver as well, and I saw your reaction to it as well, was that tractor on the track when Gasly drove past at quite high speeds, which was dealt with as well and put into question. But how do you want to see those situations being handled in the future? Because I think there was a lot of question around why that vehicle was on the track to begin with, as well as why Gasly was going at that speed, and he was adamant that he was, holding to his safety car delta time, and the red flag obviously came out just a second before he reached this area. But yeah, what are your thoughts on how they can handle this going forward?
Well, I was horrified because I had an incident there at Suzuka in 1994 when I'd been crying on the radio for the race to be red flag because the conditions were horrific. And I aquaplaned off in a place that I couldn't see where I was going. I was stuck up behind fence and just literally couldn't see even my own dashboard. And I went off, and I just missed one of those little caterpillar diggers, but unfortunately hit a marshal and ran back to help him, and the bone of his leg was sticking out of his overalls. It was a horrible mess, and I felt awful. He came through my cockpit, and I'd also said after that experience, that was 94. I remember saying in 98 in Nürburgring, I think in commentary, we can't have vehicles on track when race cars are on track because it's often in wet conditions as well, and you can aquaplane off the track, you can have a car issue, whatever. And it should never happen. Then, of course, we did have the awful incident in Suzuka again, 2014, when we effectively lost Jules Bianchi. You just can't have it. It's unquestionably unacceptable. That should have been an instant red flag, in my personal opinion, because of the conditions, because everybody was out there on intermediates. That's something else that needs changing. The race director can command that if it's a safety car start, everybody must be on full wets. And I think he should have a carte blanche to demand and save the teams from themselves full wets. We will start the race at, and it will be extreme wet tires, so that teams are not driven down the competitive route of putting intermediates on when they know they're not quite right and hoping they get away with it. Because those conditions weren't right for intermediates, extreme wets. They probably looked okay, but you can't see where you're going in the cars. You're still going quite quickly, even at safety car speeds, by anybody's measure. And I'm going to assume that Alex Albon's stricken Williams was somewhere in the vicinity as well. And I've seen other footage. The truck was straight out there, marshals on track. Lessons hadn't been learned. Because we know there was debris around. Some of it was on the front of Gasly's car. That had to be a red flag with a car in a really critical position, high speed, in those conditions. There was no alternative. Not even a question of just collecting the cars up in the crocodile snake behind the safety car to buy you time to get the car out of the way, because the place where that car was and the debris that was on the track absolutely meant people and vehicles had to go on the track. And so it was an instant red flag for me.